Before this story begins, take a moment to understand why it matters. What you are about to see is not fiction, not a rumor, and not a distant historical case. It is a real story that unfolded quietly in modern America, hidden in plain sight for decades. Stories like this only come to light when people are willing to listen, question, and share. If you believe that forgotten lives deserve to be seen, subscribe to this channel, stay until the end, and share this video. Awareness is the first step toward accountability, and silence is what allowed this story to exist for so long. The story of the Whittaker family begins in a place that feels almost disconnected from modern America. Deep in the Appalachian region of West Virginia lies a small rural area known as Odd. It is not a town in the traditional sense. There are no clear borders, no central square, no defining landmarks. Odd exists quietly, surrounded by dense forests, narrow dirt roads, and long stretches of land where houses are scattered far apart. This isolation would become the defining factor of the Whittaker family's existence. For decades, Odd remained largely untouched by progress. While the rest of the country modernized, this region struggled with poverty, limited infrastructure, and a lack of consistent government oversight. Many residents lived off the grid, relying on informal labor, government assistance, or family support to survive. Isolation was not unusual here, but in the case of the Whittakers, it reached an extreme. The Whittaker family's home sat at the edge of this forgotten landscape. The property was cluttered with broken vehicles, scrap metal, abandoned furniture, and debris accumulated over years. The house itself showed clear signs of neglect, deteriorating walls, unstable floors, and an overall sense of decay. Yet no alarms were raised, no inspections followed, no intervention came. In rural communities like Odd, there exists a deeply rooted culture of non-interference. Neighbors often avoid involvement in what they perceive as family matters. Suspicion of outsiders, including social workers and law enforcement, runs deep. Over time, this culture of silence became a shield, not one that protected the Whittakers, but one that hid them. People in the area were aware of the family. They saw them walking along the road, noticed their unusual behavior, and whispered among themselves. Some felt discomfort, others felt fear, but very few felt responsibility. The Whittakers became a known but unspoken presence, a family everyone recognized and no one truly acknowledged. Geography played a critical role in their disappearance from public awareness. With no close neighbors and limited transportation, the family rarely traveled beyond their immediate surroundings. Access to schools, hospitals, and social services required effort and resources they did not have. Over time, the outside world became irrelevant to their daily survival. This isolation was not the result of a single failure, but of many small absences. No teacher filed a report. No social worker followed up. No consistent welfare checks were conducted. Each missing action allowed the silence to deepen. As years passed, the Whittakers existed in a kind of parallel reality, physically present in the United States, yet functionally invisible. They did not participate in society, not because they refused to, but because society never truly reached them. The place they lived shaped who they became. In Odd, it was possible to disappear without leaving. And the Whittaker family did exactly that. This first layer of the story is essential to understanding everything that followed. Without isolation, none of the later tragedies would have unfolded the way they did. The land, the culture, and the silence created the conditions for a family to fade out of view, quietly, completely, and for decades. At the center of the Whittaker family's story lies a reality that is difficult to confront and even harder to discuss. Generations of intermarriage within the same bloodline. This was not a rumor created by the internet, nor a theory imposed later for shock value. It was a pattern quietly acknowledged by locals long before the family became known to the world. In isolated rural communities, genetic diversity depends heavily on movement, education, and social interaction. In odd West Virginia, these elements were limited. Families lived far apart, transportation was scarce, new people rarely arrived, and even more rarely stayed. Over time, social circles shrank and family lines folded inward. For the Whittakers, this process continued for decades. Accounts suggest that cousins married cousins, and that relationships occurred between relatives who, in broader society, would never be allowed or accepted. These relationships were not driven by malice or manipulation, but by a closed environment where alternatives simply did not exist. The family did not possess the education or awareness to understand the long-term biological consequences of these unions. Endogamy, the practice of reproducing within a limited genetic group, is well documented in medical science. Over successive generations, harmful genetic traits become amplified. Conditions that might remain dormant in a diverse population begin to manifest with increasing severity. Cognitive impairments, speech disorders, physical abnormalities, and neurological conditions become more frequent and more extreme. By the time the younger members of the Whittaker family were born, the damage had already accumulated. Several siblings exhibited profound developmental disabilities. Their behavior, speech limitations, and motor functions reflected conditions that typically require lifelong medical supervision and specialized care. Yet none of this care existed. There were no diagnoses, no treatment plans, no interventions of any kind. What makes this aspect of the story particularly tragic is the absence of intent. The Whittakers did not knowingly perpetuate genetic harm. They inherited a closed system and continued living within it because they lacked the tools to escape. Their choices were shaped by ignorance, not cruelty. In communities like Odd, discussions about genetics, health risks, and inherited conditions were virtually non-existent. Medical access was limited, and trust in outside professionals was often low. The idea of seeking genetic counseling would have been unthinkable, not only financially, but culturally. As generations passed, the bloodline narrowed further. With each cycle, the chances of severe impairment increased. Children were born into a reality already determined before their first breath. Importantly, this was not hidden. Locals noticed. The signs were visible. The behaviors were impossible to ignore. Yet once again, silence prevailed. No formal reports were filed. No sustained welfare checks occurred. The family remained untouched by the systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. This raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does societal non-intervention become complicity? The Whittaker case demonstrates that genetic collapse does not happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, quietly, across generations, until intervention feels too late and responsibility feels too diffuse. The bloodline closed in on itself, not because no one could see what was happening, but because no one chose to stop it. This chapter of the story forces us to confront the limits of personal freedom, cultural isolation, and collective responsibility. When does respecting autonomy become abandonment? And who is accountable when harm is inherited rather than inflicted? For the Whittakers, the answer came decades too late. Language is one of the most fundamental tools of human development. It allows people to express pain, ask for help, form relationships, and understand the world around them. For the Whittaker family, language was not simply limited. For several members, it never fully developed at all. From an early age, many of the Whittaker children showed severe speech delays. Words did not form. Sentences never came. Instead, communication relied on gestures, sounds, whistles, grunts, and repetitive noises. What might initially appear to an outsider as odd behavior was, in reality, the result of profound developmental barriers compounded by complete social isolation. Language does not develop in a vacuum. It requires interaction, correction, stimulation, and exposure. In the Whittaker household, none of these conditions were present. Parents and caregivers lacked the ability to teach speech themselves. There were no therapists, no schools, and no medical professionals involved. As a result, silence became the norm. Without language, the world becomes dangerously small. Concepts such as time, money, rules, or personal rights remain abstract or entirely unknown. There is no way to ask questions or understand explanations. Cause and effect blur together. Life becomes reactive rather than intentional. For the Whittakers, childhood did not include education in any formal sense. School attendance was inconsistent or non-existent. No individualized education plans were created. No evaluations were conducted. Their absence from classrooms passed unnoticed, or worse, unchallenged. This failure had cascading effects. Without language, literacy never emerged. Without literacy, independence was impossible. Everyday tasks that most people take for granted, reading instructions, filling out forms, understanding signs, were permanently out of reach. More importantly, the lack of language removed any possibility of self-advocacy. The Whittakers could not report neglect. They could not describe pain. They could not explain their living conditions. Even if authorities had asked questions, meaningful answers would have been difficult or impossible to obtain. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The less they communicated, the less people attempted to communicate with them. Over time, outsiders stopped trying altogether. Silence was mistaken for acceptance. Behavior often replaced language. Some family members displayed repetitive movements, sudden emotional reactions, or instinctive responses to stress. Without understanding context, observers sometimes interpreted these behaviors as aggression or unpredictability, further reinforcing fear and distance. Crucially, this was not a case of individuals refusing to speak. It was a case of individuals who were never given the chance to learn how. The human brain has critical developmental windows. When language exposure does not occur during early childhood, the ability to acquire it later becomes severely limited. By adulthood, those windows are largely closed. This means that even when attention finally arrived, the damage could not be undone. For the Whittakers, the absence of language became a permanent barrier between them and the rest of society. They lived among people, yet remained fundamentally unreachable. Their thoughts, fears, and needs stayed locked inside. This chapter of their story reveals one of the most painful truths of all. Neglect does not always appear as violence. Sometimes it appears as silence, a silence so complete that it erases a person's voice before it ever exists. To understand the Whittaker family, one must understand the environment in which they lived. Their home was not merely a backdrop to their story, it was an active force shaping their behavior, health, and perception of reality. Life inside the house reflected years of neglect, poverty, and isolation, normalized through repetition. The structure itself was in a state of visible deterioration. Walls showed signs of decay, floors appeared unstable, windows were often broken or covered. Basic maintenance had been absent for so long that the house no longer resembled a functional living space by modern standards. Yet for the Whittakers, this environment was familiar. It was all they had ever known. Sanitation was one of the most critical issues. Trash accumulated both inside and outside the home. Food containers, discarded objects, and debris piled up over time. Animals moved freely through the space, blurring the line between shelter and exposure. Clean water was not always accessible, and food safety was an ongoing concern. There were no routines centered on hygiene or organization, not because of neglect in the conventional sense, but because the knowledge and ability to maintain such routines were never developed. Concepts like cleanliness, safety standards, or long-term health consequences were abstract ideas, disconnected from daily survival. Electricity, when available, was unreliable. Heating and cooling were inconsistent. During colder months, survival depended on makeshift solutions rather than stable infrastructure. During warmer months, ventilation was poor, and the house trapped heat and odors, creating an environment that was physically and psychologically oppressive. Despite these conditions, the family rarely left the property. The outside world represented uncertainty and fear. Inside the house, however deteriorated, there was familiarity. Even discomfort can feel safer than the unknown. This is a critical psychological factor often overlooked in cases of extreme neglect. When individuals grow up without exposure to alternatives, they do not perceive their circumstances as abnormal. There is no internal reference point for better. As a result, the impulse to escape never formed. The house also functioned as a boundary between the Whittakers and society. Few visitors entered. Those who did often left quickly, unsettled by what they encountered. Without sustained contact, the family's isolation deepened. The home became a closed system, reinforcing behaviors and conditions that might have been challenged elsewhere. Importantly, there was no single moment of collapse. The environment did not deteriorate suddenly. It declined slowly, year by year, as small problems went unresolved. A broken fixture was never repaired. Trash was never removed. Health concerns were never addressed. Over time, neglect became structural. This gradual decay made intervention less likely. Extreme situations often provoke reaction. Slow deterioration, on the other hand, blends into the background. It becomes invisible, even to those living inside it. For the Whittakers, the house was not a choice. It was an inheritance. Each generation passed down not only genetic traits, but also an environment shaped by deprivation and abandonment. The physical space mirrored their social reality, unstable, unsupported, and forgotten. Life inside the house was not defined by cruelty, but by absence. Absence of care, absence of knowledge, absence of intervention. And in that absence, years passed. The Whittaker family did not live in complete secrecy. They were not hidden deep in the wilderness. Unreachable or unknown, people in the surrounding community were aware of them. They saw them walking along the road, noticed their unusual behavior, and spoke quietly about them among themselves. What defines this chapter of the story is not ignorance, but inaction. In small, rural communities like Odd, West Virginia, social norms often prioritize privacy over intervention. Families are expected to handle their own affairs. Outsiders, especially government workers, are often viewed with suspicion. Over time, this mindset can create an environment where neglect is tolerated as long as it remains out of sight. The Whittakers existed in this grey zone. They were seen, but not engaged. Known, but not understood. Their presence made people uncomfortable, and discomfort often leads to avoidance rather than action. Some neighbors reportedly described the family as strange or different. Others expressed fear, not because the Whittakers were violent, but because their behavior was unfamiliar. Limited speech, sudden movements, and difficulty with social cues created a barrier that few attempted to cross. Instead of curiosity, there was distance. Crucially, there were moments when intervention could have occurred. Children who did not attend school, adults who showed clear signs of severe disability, living conditions that failed to meet basic safety standards. Each of these indicators on its own could have triggered sustained involvement from social services, but involvement requires persistence. It requires follow-up, and it requires a sense of responsibility that extends beyond legal obligation. In the Whittaker case, responsibility was diluted. Some assumed that someone else had already checked on them. Others believed the family was receiving assistance. A few may have thought intervention would make things worse. When responsibility is shared by many, it often belongs to no one. Local authorities reportedly had awareness of the family at various points over the years, yet no long-term plan was implemented. No consistent monitoring occurred. Without documentation, oversight faded. Time passed, silence returned. This pattern reflects a broader systemic issue. Social services are often reactive rather than proactive. They respond to reports, crises, and visible emergencies. Families like the Whittakers, who existed in a state of chronic neglect rather than acute crisis, fell through the cracks. There is also the question of fear of overstepping, fear of legal consequences, fear of community backlash. In close-knit rural areas, intervening in family matters can lead to social isolation. Doing nothing is often easier, but ease is not neutrality. By choosing not to act, the community indirectly reinforced the family's isolation. Each year without intervention made the situation more entrenched and more difficult to change. What might have been addressed with support and education in one generation became irreversible in the next. This chapter challenges a comforting narrative that extreme suffering is always hidden or unknown. Sometimes it is visible, familiar, and quietly accepted. The Whittaker family did not fall through the cracks of society. They lived in them, and the silence that surrounded them was not empty. It was filled with missed opportunities. For decades, the Whittaker family existed in near total obscurity. That silence was broken not by government agencies, social services, or local authorities, but by a camera. The moment the world discovered the Whittakers did not come through an official report or an emergency intervention. It came through a documentary project shared on the internet. In the late 2010s, photographer and filmmaker Mark Leiter traveled through rural America, documenting people living on the margins of society. His project focused on individuals rarely seen or heard, allowing them to speak or exist in front of the camera without narration or judgment. During this process, he was introduced to the Whittaker family. What he encountered was unlike anything most viewers had ever seen. The first recordings showed adult siblings who struggled to speak, communicate, or engage in conventional conversation. Some responded with sounds rather than words. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Their behavior appeared instinctive rather than social, shaped by years of isolation and untreated disability. The environment surrounding them reinforced the shock. The house, the debris, the animals, and the absence of basic living standards painted a picture that felt incompatible with life in the United States. Viewers were forced to confront a reality they believed no longer existed. When the footage was released online, it spread rapidly. Millions watched within days. Reactions were intense and divided. Some felt deep sympathy, others felt disbelief, many expressed anger. Not at the family, but at the systems that allowed such conditions to persist for so long. For the first time, the Whittakers were visible on a global scale. This visibility marked a turning point, but it also raised complex questions. The family did not seek attention. They did not understand the reach of the internet or the implications of exposure. Consent in such cases exists in a fragile and ethically complicated space. Yet without this exposure, nothing would have changed. As attention grew, journalists, commentators, and viewers began asking questions that had gone unasked for decades. How had this happened? Who was responsible? Why had no one intervened? The story shifted from curiosity to accountability. The internet, often criticized for exploitation and sensationalism, became the catalyst for action. Donations poured in from around the world. Viewers demanded updates. Pressure mounted on local authorities to respond. Ironically, the same systems that failed to protect the Whittakers for decades began to act only once the world was watching. This moment revealed a troubling truth. Visibility creates urgency. Suffering without witnesses can persist indefinitely. Suffering with an audience becomes unacceptable. The Whittakers themselves remained largely unchanged by the attention in terms of understanding. Their daily routines did not suddenly transform. What changed was the response around them. Support arrived not because of policy, but because of public outrage. This chapter of the story forces us to confront the power and danger of exposure. It shows how easily people can be forgotten and how quickly they can become symbols once discovered. The Whittaker family did not step into the spotlight. The spotlight found them, and once it did, There was no turning back. When the footage of the Whittaker family spread across the internet, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of viewers encountered a reality that felt incompatible with their understanding of modern life. Shock, compassion, anger, and disbelief flooded comment sections and social platforms. But as attention grew, so did controversy. The central question was unavoidable. Was this exposure helping the Whittakers or exploiting them? On one side were those who argued that the videos violated the family's dignity. Critics pointed out the family's limited ability to understand consent, questioning whether they could truly agree to being filmed and broadcast to a global audience. They warned that turning human suffering into content risked reducing complex lives to spectacle. On the other side were those who argued that without exposure, the Whittakers would have remained invisible indefinitely. For decades, silence had protected neglect. The camera, they argued, broke that silence. The resulting attention brought food, repairs, and assistance that no institution had provided before. Both perspectives held uncomfortable truths. The ethical dilemma was not abstract. It played out in real time as donations surged. Online fundraisers collected tens of thousands of dollars. Viewers demanded updates and accountability. The family's living conditions became a subject of public scrutiny. This raised further concerns. Once attention arrives, it rarely leaves quietly. Viewers expect progress. They want transformation. But real change, especially after decades of neglect, is slow and limited. When improvement does not match expectation, disappointment follows. In the Whittaker case, progress was incremental. The house received repairs. Food and supplies became more consistent. The family gained some degree of support. Yet the fundamental realities, cognitive disabilities, limited communication, lifelong isolation, remained unchanged. Some viewers misinterpreted this as failure. Others questioned where donations went. Suspicion emerged, fueled by the Internet's tendency to demand transparency without patience. This reaction revealed another ethical tension, the expectation that suffering must be resolved quickly once it becomes visible. When it is not, blame shifts. The family themselves were largely absent from this debate. They did not participate in online discussions or public statements. They existed at the center of a storm they could not fully comprehend. Meanwhile, the broader conversation expanded. The Whittakers became a case study in how society responds to extreme neglect once it is no longer hidden. Is attention enough? Is aid meaningful if it arrives late? Can dignity be preserved in exposure? There were no clear answers. What became evident, however, was that the viral response said as much about the audience as it did about the family. Viewers were forced to confront their own relationship with suffering, how easily they consume it, how quickly they judge it, and how rarely they engage with its root causes. The Whittaker story challenged the comforting idea that moral outrage alone leads to justice. Outrage creates movement, but without sustained responsibility, it fades. In this sense, the ethical questions surrounding the case remain unresolved. Exposure helped, but it also transformed a private tragedy into public discourse. Whether that transformation was necessary or harmful depends on perspective. What is certain is this: once the Whittakers became visible, society could no longer claim ignorance, and with awareness comes obligation. When public attention reached its peak, assistance finally arrived for the Whittaker family. Donations from around the world provided resources that had been absent for decades. Food supplies increased, the house received repairs, basic necessities became more reliable. For the first time in their lives, the Whittakers experienced sustained external support. Yet the impact of this help was limited by time. Decades of neglect cannot be undone by sudden generosity. Human development follows irreversible timelines. Skills that are not learned in childhood often cannot be acquired later. Cognitive impairments left untreated for years do not disappear. Language, once missed during critical developmental periods, rarely emerges fully in adulthood. The assistance helped the family survive, but survival was never the core problem. Medical evaluations, when finally considered, faced enormous challenges. Many family members struggled to communicate symptoms or discomfort. Diagnosing conditions became difficult. Treatment options were constrained not only by disability, but by the reality that interventions were arriving too late to change foundational outcomes. Education, another potential avenue for improvement, was no longer viable in a traditional sense. Structured learning environments require early exposure. For adults who had never developed basic literacy or social comprehension, integration into such systems was unrealistic. This reality frustrated many outside observers. Viewers who had donated hoped for visible transformation. They expected a narrative of rescue. Instead, they encountered a harsher truth. Not all damage can be repaired. This disconnect between expectation and reality exposed a common misunderstanding about neglect. Society often imagines suffering as something that can be fixed if addressed quickly enough. But when neglect spans generations, its effects become structural rather than situational. The Whittaker family had lived their entire lives without consistent healthcare, education, or advocacy. Their needs were not short-term. They required lifelong, specialized support, the kind that systems rarely provide without sustained commitment. Even well-intentioned help carried risks. Sudden changes in environment and routine can be destabilizing for individuals with severe cognitive disabilities. Overexposure, new people, and unfamiliar expectations can create stress rather than relief. Aid must be careful, gradual, and informed. What arrived, though meaningful, was reactive rather than planned. It addressed immediate needs but struggled to create long-term stability. This is not a criticism of those who helped, but a reflection of how unprepared society is to respond to deep, invisible neglect. The phrase, "too late," does not mean help was useless. It means that the most important moments for intervention had passed long before attention arrived. The damage was already woven into the family's biology and psychology. This chapter underscores a painful reality. Visibility can prompt action, but timing determines impact. Had support arrived generations earlier, outcomes might have been different. Children might have received education, health issues might have been treated, genetic risks might have been understood. Silence allowed those possibilities to vanish. In the end, the help that came changed the present, but could not rewrite the past. The story of the Whittaker family is often framed as an anomaly, a rare and extreme case that somehow slipped through the cracks. But when examined closely, it becomes clear that what happened to the Whittakers was not the result of a single failure, but of many small failures compounded over time. It was systemic. Modern societies rely on interconnected systems to identify vulnerability. Schools, healthcare providers, social services, and local authorities. Each system acts as a checkpoint. When one fails, another is supposed to intervene. In the Whittaker case, every checkpoint failed. Children who did not attend school should have triggered concern. Adults with severe disabilities should have received evaluations. Living conditions that posed clear health risks should have resulted in inspections. Yet none of these mechanisms functioned as intended. One reason lies in how systems prioritize urgency. Social services are often designed to respond to immediate crises, abuse reports, emergencies, visible violence. Chronic neglect, especially when it unfolds slowly and without formal complaints, does not generate the same response. It becomes background noise. Geographic isolation intensified this problem. Rural areas frequently suffer from underfunded services, staff shortages, and limited oversight. Caseworkers are overwhelmed. Follow-ups are inconsistent. When no crisis forces action, cases fade from attention. Documentation also plays a critical role. Without sustained records, concern resets with each encounter. A single welfare check that produces no immediate crisis can close a case indefinitely. In the Whittaker situation, this lack of continuity allowed years and generations to pass without intervention. There is also the issue of jurisdictional ambiguity. Responsibility becomes unclear when families exist at the intersection of multiple systems. Is it a health issue, an education issue, a housing issue? When responsibility is divided, accountability weakens. Cultural factors further complicated intervention. In rural communities, resistance to external authority is common. Officials may hesitate to push too hard, fearing backlash or accusations of overreach. Respect for autonomy, while important, can become a shield for neglect. The Whittaker case reveals how easily systems can mistake endurance for stability. The family survived year after year, and survival was misinterpreted as adequacy. As long as no one died, no emergency was declared. This is one of the most dangerous assumptions in social policy, that survival equals well-being. The systemic failure extended beyond public institutions. It included the broader social contract, the unspoken agreement that communities will look after their most vulnerable members. That contract broke down silently. Importantly, this was not caused by lack of resources alone. It was caused by lack of coordination, persistence, and accountability. Help existed, but it never arrived at the right time, in the right form, or with the necessary commitment. The Whittaker family did not disappear because systems did not exist. They disappeared because systems did not connect. This chapter reframes the story from individual tragedy to collective responsibility. It forces a re-evaluation of how society defines neglect, how it measures success, and how easily people can be forgotten when they do not fit conventional categories. If the Whittakers could remain unseen for decades, the question is not whether systems failed, but how often they continue to fail without being noticed. The Whittaker family did not choose to become a symbol. They did not seek attention, recognition, or representation. Yet their story has come to represent something far larger than a single family living in isolation. It has become a mirror, one that reflects uncomfortable truths about neglect, responsibility, and the limits of modern society's compassion. What the Whittakers leave behind is not a mystery to be solved, but a warning to be understood. Their lives challenge the assumption that extreme neglect belongs to the past or to distant places. The Whittaker case proves that invisibility can exist within the borders of a developed nation, sustained not by secrecy, but by indifference. It shows how easily human beings can fall outside the systems designed to protect them, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet omission. The family's story also exposes the long-term cost of silence. Silence from institutions, silence from communities, silence from individuals who noticed something was wrong but did not act. Over time, that silence became structural, embedding itself into biology, psychology, and environment. There is no dramatic resolution to this story, no moment where everything is fixed, no transformation arc that restores what was lost. That absence is the point. The Whittakers remind us that some harm cannot be undone, that early intervention matters more than late compassion, that visibility, while powerful, is not a substitute for prevention. Their legacy forces difficult questions. How many families exist in similar conditions, never filmed, never shared, never discovered? How many cases of chronic neglect are normalized because they do not erupt into crisis? And how many systems congratulate themselves for functioning while quietly failing the most vulnerable? In public reaction, the Whittakers became a symbol of outrage, but outrage fades. What remains is responsibility. A responsibility that extends beyond donations and viral attention. It demands structural change, persistent oversight, and a willingness to intervene before damage becomes permanent. The story also complicates the narrative of autonomy. Respecting privacy is essential, but when privacy becomes isolation and isolation becomes harm, non-intervention is no longer neutral. The Whittaker case challenges society to redefine the boundary between freedom and abandonment. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Whittakers is the discomfort they provoke. Discomfort at realizing that help often arrives only when suffering becomes visible. Discomfort at recognizing how easily we look away. Discomfort at understanding that systems are only as effective as the people who enforce them. They leave behind no manifesto, no demands, no explanations. What they leave is a question, one that does not belong to them alone. What does it mean to care for those who cannot ask for help? The answer to that question determines whether the Whittaker story remains an exception or a pattern repeated quietly, again and again. Their lives were shaped by absence. Their story leaves us with responsibility. The Whittaker family's story does not end when this video ends. It continues in every place where silence allows neglect to grow. If this documentary made you uncomfortable, it should. Discomfort is where awareness begins. By subscribing to this channel, sharing this video, and leaving your thoughts in the comments, you help keep stories like this from disappearing again. These are not just stories, they are warnings. The more people who see them, the harder it becomes to look away. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for refusing to let silence be the final chapter.